Okay, I have started the broadcast, so I have a few slides to get through, and hopefully all the timing will work out, but feel free to stop me for questions. However, I'll give people a chance at the end as well if you want to kind of keep note. Talking about Symfony for Drupal developers, how many people here program in other languages than PHP and do framework programming in those? Okay, a few of you. And how many people also do framework programming in PHP, not just Drupal? Okay, kind of the same group. All right, so some of this is kind of oriented at explaining what a framework is and why you might want to use that, but then we'll get a little more into the specifics of Symfony. And hopefully along the way kind of give you an idea of why Drupal 8 chose to use Symfony components, as well as what the alternatives, if you have projects that don't quite meet the Drupal sweet spot of functionality, and that some alternatives for what you could do based on something that you're already going to be familiar with once Drupal 8 comes out. So, in brief word about me, I'm Sandy Smith. I'm the CEO of PHP Architect. We put out PHP Architect magazine. It's been in print since 2002, and is actually in physical print at the moment. And we put on the PHP Tech Conference each year, and we're putting on another conference in November. And I've been doing PHP for about 14 years, and then I've been doing Drupal since kind of early, midway into the Drupal 5 release. Since then, I've been somewhat kept up with it ever since. But I also do a fair amount of pure PHP programming, both straight-up application writing as well as framework development for specific applications. So that's kind of the perspective I'm coming from. So the first thing I did when I started preparing this talk was tweet out, hey, what would people want to know from an introduction to Symfony like this? And one of the most insightful ones I got back was a guy who said, okay, why should I care? Well, in the end, what does this all kind of matter to me, and how does this make me awesome? So in order to answer that, let's talk a little bit about the difference between an application framework and a content management system. So content management system, framework of which usually a content management system also has, and Drupal is kind of famously known as the content management system that's sort of morphed into an application framework. It usually provides some way of routing requests. So going from a specific URL with certain things in the URL string to a specific point in your code to then act on it in a way that you've customized. Generally, there's a way to abstract out the request and response that you're getting from the web server and that you're sending back to the web server, so you're not having to actually, parse and return raw HTTP, which is lots of fun. It usually provides controllers for MVC frameworks. We'll get into that a little bit later. And generally, there's some sort of form generation, handling, and data validation, as well as some sort of data abstraction layer, a way so you're not having to continually write SQL by hand, or deal with other systems if you're not dealing with an actual SQL relational database. And it also provides some sort of templating or view structure to it so that you can separate your presentation from your actual business logic. Now, if you've done Drupal development, that all kind of seems a little bit familiar. CMSs on top of that, though, provide usually a unified data model. In WordPress, everything is surrounded by posts. In Drupal, it's nodes, and then you have the field API. They have built-in production-ready content editing tools. Especially WordPress is really known for this. Drupal with Drupal 7 did a huge back-end refresh to kind of get better at that, and that's where dropping in a lot of these editing tools has become kind of really mandatory, and stepping up your game is now expected of a content management system. There's usually some sort of menu system because content management systems are there to kind of manage the entire layout of the site, And there's also an opinion, and this is probably the most important part about an actual CMS versus a framework. CMSs tend to be fairly opinionated about the type of site you're going to be building. It's going to be content heavy, it's going to be semi-structured, there's going to have some sort of menu structure as well as individual content types, but they're going to be displayed yet generally in a kind of page-centric sort of way. And that's where, when doing development, the phrase "doing it the Drupal way," making your life easier, comes into being. It's because Drupal kind of has an opinion about the sort of way you should do things in a site. It provides a lot of room for customization of that, but as we've all known, if we try to fight that too hard, or the client comes up with some bizarre request for how a specific edge case should be handled, that can start getting kind of messy very quickly. So a lot of what is the point of then using a framework is that a lot of that end customization, where you end up sort of fighting that opinion that your content management system has, can actually end up taking forever. And so, I joked about this at one point on Twitter, but it's really been my experience that I spend an inordinate amount of time arguing about how the menu structure should, or the breadcrumb structure should look. And nobody pays attention to it other than the people who are helping develop the site afterwards. No customer has ever come up to me and said, like, I'd really like it if your breadcrumbs worked slightly differently. It's just not a key thing, but man, do people argue over it. So you'll spend an inordinate amount of time getting these very last end details right, to then force things to fight between the way Drupal thinks they should be organized and the way it kind of wants you to do them easily, and just how quickly you can use something like Drupal or WordPress to build out especially with Drupal, you can do a really powerful and functional site incredibly quickly. But to do all the customizations of exactly how it should do some of those functions takes for frickin' ever. So basically what you're doing when you use a application framework is you're saying, I don't necessarily have a particularly content managey kind of site. I have an actual web application. I'm doing something more like Amazon. I'm doing something more like Twitter. I'm doing something more like Facebook. And it doesn't quite conform to the expectations and the use cases that Drupal developers kind of have in mind as they're developing it. All the Drupal developers of all the community and all the contributed modules. So that's when you might want to pull back and use a framework. Because it doesn't make as many assumptions for you, it still makes some assumptions. Anytime you have something that's giving you a hand up to kind of get you past the basics, it's making assumptions about what you're going to be doing. And a lot of choosing the right tool is making sure that its assumptions and what you're actually doing kind of mesh nicely. But a framework doesn't make quite as many about how exactly you're going to implement some of these things, which then has a trade-off. You're going to have to do a little more yourself, but you get much more fine-grained control. And so if the client comes in and says, no, in this case, when it's raining on Tuesday, I want the breadcrumbs to be in reverse order, you just write a little exception to that into your code, and bam. It's not you're not having to hack core, you're not doing anything funky. It's all still there, and it's maintainable in a way that other developers can come behind you and understand, because you're using a standardized application framework. So why Symfony specifically? Well, to do that, let's talk a little bit about how kind of PHP has evolved. It is a much different language than it was even just like 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And it's been evolving. I mean, when Drupal 4 was written and it became super popular, PHP was still in version 4, and that was the predominant one that was out there. And it took forever to kind of get a coordinated effort from WordPress and Drupal and a lot of these application developers to get people to even upgrade to PHP 5. And that meant that a lot of just basic object-oriented goodness and that sort of stuff just didn't exist in the language. But since then, Composer, through kind of the framework interoperability group, which actually kind of started from discussions at the conference we put on now, before we actually took it over. But the developers of Symfony and Framework and a lot of these actually got together and said, hey, why do we keep having to reinvent this wheel Yeah, why can't I just rip out one piece from your framework and drop it into mine and have it just work? Why is this so hard? So they came up with basically a dependency management system. So if you've ever used gems on Ruby, you're familiar with the kind of thing it is. You can just simply do gem install, blah, 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 and you get a new component ready for you to use. Well, similarly, Composer lets you do that for PHP. Also then has a standard kind of pre-approved library called Packagist, which lets you actually go through and find kind of vetted modules that do bits of things. So there's also some standards behind all of this. Standards for even just how to lay out your code. There's one that's for logging that just got approved that I believe Drupal 8 will now be following. So there's a lot of kind of interoperability stuff that's been taken care of and unified. And then at the same time, getting best practices from other languages like unit testing and automated deployments and automated testing at various levels. BHAT and PHP unit obviously is a big one. These things have come and they've become a standard part of the tool set. And because now there's a standard way to kind of inject dependencies into your application, all this is, it's much easier to get a kind of nicely tested tools with a set of tests you can run and verify, yes, in fact, everything I've pulled in is working as designed and as specified. And Symfony, basically, when they did Symfony 2, they decided to kind of start fresh and do all of these things at best practices. So there's lots of stuff around dependency injection and nicely separated concerns, and it also uses Composer kind of from the ground up to kind of structure how the application works, and it makes it really easy to then extend with a lot of third-party tools, and then makes it easier for other projects like Drupal to come along and say, hey, why should we have our own HTTP kernel? Let's just use Symfony's. Let's use their routing. Let's use all these sorts of tools that they've already built and have a nice set of tests for them. We don't have to rebuild it and maintain our own versions. So as kind of follows from that, you have then tons of third-party bundles. So if you want to implement a nested tree structure that is potentially of infinite depth, there's a couple different modules, actually, a couple different things you can pull in, bundles in Symfony speak. And it uses all these best practices for object-oriented programming. And because and we'll get into a little bit about how it's organized, you can pretty much rip out any component of it you're not happy with and replace it with your own or with a different one. And as long as it kind of conforms to the interface, or you need to maybe make a little adapter, but you can do it fairly easily. And so it means you can grow and scale and do things like that. And when you need to rip out a piece of the application because the way it's implemented just isn't performant enough or it isn't scalable enough, you can do that. And the rest of it just kind of keeps working because of the way it encourages you to develop. It also has a console like Drush it's a command line app that's extensible and you can add things to. And so when you add a lot of these modules, they also come with new commands for it. And it has built-in support for deploying to different environments. So, right from the get-go, it's encouraging you to think about whether you're going to be on your own laptop developing, whether you're going to be on a staging site, validating content, or whether it's actually going into production, and handles a lot of the configuration changes that you're going to want automatically for you. You don't have to build that in. And if you've gone to any of the various deployment talks for Drupal, you know that's not something that Drupal 7 is the strongest at. And it also has Devel-like browser-based development tools to let you kind of see what's going on underneath the hood, talk to the data access layer and a few of these other things to really understand what's going on, and kind of pretty prints a lot of the error messages for you, does a lot to help you. And of course it has a large and active community, which is one of Drupal's secrets to success. So it has all these things going for it, and that's kind of why it was a natural project for Drupal 8 developers as they looked at it to kind of say, hey, here's some good bits we can steal and not reinvent that wheel again. So let's talk through kind of how a Symfony application is organized. To do that, we need to talk about MVC frameworks. How many here are familiar with the Model View Controller? Okay, good. Fair number of you. So this may be a little harsh, but It's fair, I think. When you're doing development, especially if you're trying to find that thing in the field API or whatever, the right hook to implement, Drupal gets, well, there's just a lot of hooks that come in, and you have to find the right place where you can put it in and hope that your module is coming in at the right point in the request to actually do what you want to do and not be blocked by another module. Conceptually, model view controller is a little bit easier. You have a request comes in, it comes into a front controller. That front controller then determines the right controller to pass off the request to, that then implements the right action. The controller then talks to a model, which then talks to all your data layers, and they can be, the reason I separate it from actually being something like what Rails tries to do, which is your model is a table in a database. It actually should be an abstraction of potentially a couple of different data stores. And then it also then takes that data from the model and sticks it to a view, which then renders it in a particular way, and then hands out a response back, which then goes back to the web server and goes back to the browser. So conceptually, it's fairly simple. That, of course, means that there are a few more things you may have to do in order to kind of get something up and working. There's nothing like views where you can just sort of click and click and click and have a few pre-configured things done. But there are enough tools that we'll get to that make it kind of easy. I think you'll see why there's some attraction there. So I've gone a little more over exactly how the model view controller paradigm works in general. So specifically in Symfony, you have most of it works fairly standardly. For the database layer, again, it's completely swappable. You can rip it out and do your own thing if you want, but by convention, Doctrine is the so-called object relational mapper. But it also can function like a data access layer and be very agnostic about what you have behind it. And it works kind of nicely with your own kind of fat models that include all your business logic and keep them out of the controller where you're doing just kind of the switching and the traffic cop of your application. For views, you have Twig. And so Twig's important to know because it will be the templating language for Drupal 8 going forward. But basically, it's a fairly easy-to-use templating language that allows you to kind of go through some very designer-friendly tags and take components out. And it's also extensible. You can write PHP code that then does custom things depending on what you put in there. And it takes all that and formulates a response and ships it back. One extra thing you've got going on in Symfony, which we'll talk a little bit more about coming up, is that in order to keep you controller, just becoming a huge list of controllers with all the potential things you might want to have, what they do is they split it into bundles. So you can take a feature that might have potentially multiple controllers, like user authentication and logging and display, that might have a number of different aspects to it. You might need actually some REST-like things for an authentication service to it that logically should still live with the user stuff, but probably should be in its own controller. Well, you can basically bundle all those into what's called a bundle. And bundle basically contains potentially multiple controllers, multiple models, forms, helpers, etc., and view templates, all kind of packaged together in what you think and you decide makes sense as a bundle for your site. So a blog might have a number of associated things, but you can bundle it up. This also not only does it help you just sort of organize the code, but it also encourages a little bit of reuse if you have a feature that you're continually doing. And you can abstract this out. It can be pretty much any bunch of classes that you want it to be there. It by default kind of goes for this MVC architecture, but if you just want to have a set of helper classes and other things that hook into various events and determine when somebody logs into your application, you want to do something specific and you want to reuse that across sites, you can bundle it up and then simply use Composer to pull it into your next site. So when you actually install Symfony, you have a kind of four main directories that you're going to worry about. One is vendor, and vendor is now common to anybody who's doing Composer-based kind of dependency management, and that's where all the stuff you pull in from Composer lives, including, in this case, Symfony, because it very much eats its own dog food, and you pull it in through Composer. And it takes care of, you can pin it to a certain release, you can keep it to the latest stable, you can define a whole bunch of things so that when you update, it updates the things just to the versions you want to be updated to. Then app is kind of where your application-wide configuration lives. There are a couple of things in code you may need to touch there, but most of it are just in configuration files. And then source, which is where your app-specific code lives, unless you've chosen to actually bundle it off and pull it in as a dependency from Composer. Most of your code is going to live in the source directory. It also provides a way for you to have your own kind of maintained CSS assets, images, JavaScript, etc. And then finally, pub is where the web server actually touches. That contains your front controller with a bootstrap file, and you can have actually multiple front controllers if you need to for really complex layouts. It has site-level CSS and JavaScript. Again, it's very flexible in how you can actually approach this. If your site only needs it at the site level, you can do it there. If you need to do it kind of at the bundle level, you can do it there. So let's talk briefly about how you install Symfony, just so you can kind of follow along at some point. It's actually really simple. You just run this command: Composer create project, Symfony Framework Standard Edition, and then whatever your project name is, and then make sure the version number, in this case 2.5. And that will take Symfony 2.5 and stick it in there. It'll be in a source directory, which then has web app, and underneath that are the main directories for your actual application. So that's pretty easy, but I didn't say it was fast. One of the notable things with Composer is it kind of takes a while, especially when you're doing a first initial download, because in some cases, if you don't configure it correctly, it's actually going and checking stuff out of a GitHub repo and pulling it down to your system. That can take a while, but the nice thing is we now have something to do as web developers where, hardcore developers used to be able to say, oh, I'm compiling my system, that's why I'm goofing off. We can now say Composer's updating. So as you do that, the installer is interactive. It'll ask you a few questions. All this is happening in the command line as opposed to on the web browser like Drupal. For most of them, if you just want to do kind of a basic get-to-know-it install, you can just hit enter. The only thing you'll want to do is when it asks you if you want the demo project in there, type Y so that you get that, and you can kind of see how they've laid out a demo project in a bundle and taken advantage of some of these features for you. As I mentioned, it comes with a console app, and this console app is pretty handy. You call it from just above the app directory, so in this case it'd be PHP app console server run. If you're using PHP 5.4 plus, which, come on, it's been out for a long time, everybody should be using at least PHP 5.4. But 5.5 gets you such a performance boost too. You really should be on it. It's stable. 5.6 is about to come out. PHP 7 will come out after that. Let's go and upgrade. So that'll get you on your built-in web server, so you don't even need to have a local environment installed if you need it. So then when you're thinking about writing your first application, you want to at least nominally have a bundle. So as I mentioned, they're a great way to organize your code. They keep it becoming an endless list of controllers, and they kind of prevent the God controller complex, which I don't know if you've ever run into this in an MVC application, but you can have a controller which has every method that could possibly be used, every single URL you could touch on an application is in there, and so you have a 10,000 line plus controller file. Even if the individual methods aren't too big, they can get kind of just too many of them. So this encourages you to kind of think about breaking it up into discrete chunks of functionality. And again, if you have something that you need to reuse, you can do that. And bundles help you do that across Symfony applications, and they bundle it nicely so you can pull it into other projects that are MVC and kind of fairly agnostic. So by default, bundles live in that source directory. and they're in a directory with your application's namespace. So again, Symfony uses the kind of latest OOP practices. Namespaces were introduced in 5.3, and so since then, in order to avoid having really long class names to make sure that you don't collide with something else, you can simply use namespaces to kind of take care of that for you. If you use Java, it's very similar to how Java manages these things. So you'll want to have your application in a namespace or a bundle in a namespace. But you want to have the application generally in its own namespace, and then underneath that, all the bundles you're going to use for that. So in this case, if you have an application named Acme and you make that your namespace, which not coincidentally is the demo one, and you have demo bundle, then the bundle will be in source Acme demo bundle. Fortunately, again, that console app is pretty handy, so you can just generate a bundle right from the command line, and it'll do all the stuff, including putting in the required class that you need for you, and let you then manipulate it from then on without having to do that kind of boilerplate stuff yourself. So let's talk about the basics of rooting after you've got your bundle set up. Now, there's a continuum in frameworks from convention versus configuration. Rails is very famous about being convention over configuration. Symfony is much more on the configuration side, but it also comes with a lot of defaults that are kind of there by convention. But almost everything can be overwritten, and when you're writing new things, it's going to generate some boilerplate configuration for you that you can then go and fold, spindle, and mutilate however you want to. And of course, if you've ever used struts, it's kind of off the charts in configuration with gigantic XML files. So Symfony is a bit configuration heavy, and what gets a little confusing about it is it supports three separate styles of configuration. You can do YAML, which you will get to know and love in Drupal 8. XML, which is basically just a kind of wordier expression of the YAML files, and then annotations. Annotations are kind of a trick from Java where your comments in your actual code can affect then how that code is read and interpreted and what the application does based on it. It's kind of nifty in one sense that you can look at a code file and figure out what the configuration that's associated with it is. It's kind of weird in another sense because it's not actually natively supported in PHP. This is something that it does kind of as it goes and examines your application and then forces it to do a lot of caching and stuff, which it does fairly well for you, but nonetheless that comes with some costs. So that's it's a little bit weird if you haven't messed with it the first time. Generally, most times you see examples, especially for new stuff, they're going to just give the YAML version, except Doctrine, the data layer. They seem to just kind of favor annotations as their kind of chief default way to do things. So I'm going to kind of follow that in this presentation. So overall, app-config rooting.yml shows where each bundle's own rooting configuration file is. So all you have basically there is just a bunch of pointers to your bundle's configuration files for their own rooting. And it provides a way for you to not have to have, again, a huge file with every single possible rooting you could possibly have for your application. So the example of what that would look like, in this case we have admin and user and just a basic welcome. They have a unique name. This is YAML format, by the way. It's not terribly difficult. It then points to a resource and then gives a prefix. So you can, if you want, restrict anything coming to a specific kind of sub-URL of your application. In this case, we're just having all of them come through and letting each individual bundle kind of manage what it responds to on its own. This also means that in the bundle, you're not having to figure out, wait, is this supposed to be after the user or after admin, or is it including admin? And so you don't have that twice. So for simple applications, I kind of like doing this. Once you're in the bundle, again, so you have source, Acme, user bundle. And then there's a directory called resources, and in that is config. There's also public, where you can keep specific images, HTML, JavaScript, not just HTML, but also your template files, that sort of thing. But also your configuration files. So in this case, the routing file. Each one, again, has to have a unique name that it responds to, unique within the bundle. And so it gives a pattern that it responds to, and then the defaults. In this case, what it says is, go to this controller, and that's the Acme user bundle controller. Within the Acme user bundle, it goes to the user controller, and then goes to the index action method. So that's basically just a call to that object. And you can see a little bit in user create. You can also do things like limit it to only responding to post requests. So built in, you have a little bit of security there that you're not going to be updating a user with a get string. Keeps you from a couple of different little attacks. So then you have a controller. In this case, we're going to just have a very basic thing. We declare a namespace. If you've never seen PHP namespaces, they use backslashes. There's a whole huge argument. Let's not revisit it. In this case, we use the Symfony framework bundle and its controller. Again, Symfony very much eats its own dog food. All its stuff are in bundles themselves. And then we're going to use an entity that we set up, and we'll talk about that later when we talk about doctrine. And the class user controller extends that basic controller class, which gives you a whole bunch of free stuff around managing the response and request and interfacing with your views and that sort of thing. And so here's a simple one, index action. It just lists all the user entities. We have our entity manager, which we use, if you've never seen it before, where you have this get doctrine, get manager. That's a Fluent interface. Symfony is really into those as well. But all it means is, it basically keeps returning a copy of the object, so that gets popped up all the way to whatever you assign it to. So in this case, it just gets a repository and calls the find all method for it, and just specifies where it's going to look to find the entity definition. And then it's going to return a response that then renders this particular twig file and passes in the entity's array, in this case, that it would be. But it can be pretty much anything you want to pass to your view gets called in that call. So it's actually pretty simple, just to kind of go and pull stuff out of the database and list it. But let's talk a little bit more about that, about using doctrine. So first off, you're going to want to have database configuration. This is going to be a section within your parameters file. So it's going to be database driver, host, blah, 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 all very similar to what you've seen in all kinds of different PHP applications. Once you have that, you can connect, and then what you're doing is creating an entity. So basically they're the equivalent of content types in Drupal. You can use the command line to create one, and it will actually go through kind of an interactive Q&A of what fields you would like and any specific things you want to specify about those fields. And it can get kind of formal. It can also do relations to other entities and complex things like that. But in the basic, when you're just generating one, if you want to generate a simple one, this UI way is a pretty good way to do it. And it takes care of a lot of them boilerplate for you, including updating some configuration, stuff like that. Let's look at a sample entity class. It's very simple here. We just have a user class, and it has a private ID and private name. So we just got name and the ID. As you can see that there's all these funky comments with these @ORM. That's the annotations I was talking about. So this is basically configuration saying, hey, go through, and as you look at each one of these properties on this class, note that they're actually, here's the data about them, here's the metadata. So we want it to be in a column named ID, and it's going to be an integer type. It's going to be the ID for this entity. which means it's going to be unique. And then generated value, it's going to be an auto-generated value, so it knows that this is what's supposed to be the actual MySQL auto-generated ID column. And then we have a string named name. It's 150 characters long, and you can, in fact, leave it null. So you can get really complex with the specifications that you make for each of those things. But we're just keeping it simple for the example here.
Do you know what the purposes for that second add ORM /ID seems to be?
That's telling it that it is, in fact, the canonical ID for that ID column or ID property for that entity. So this is the thing that's guaranteed to be unique and is what you're going to be pulling. If you're going to reference it by ID, that's what you're going to be pulling out.
When this entity was generated, where is getting those default kind of types and value, like a length value?
You can do it a couple of ways. One, you can do it actually, it will generate this stuff for you through that command line the query that I showed you here, where you're actually using doctrine generate and you answer a bunch of questions and you specify all that then. Or you can simply take a very simple data holding class that you create with just the properties you're going to want, and then you can go in and write these annotations yourself, because they're just comments. So you just write them, and they have the documentation of what exactly each one means, and that's where you can specify the stuff of how I want this particular property to be represented in the database. And it manages all of that for you.
But this only creates the class, it doesn't create like the database kind of a bucket for this.
Yeah, it actually creates, if you use the command line one, it creates both. And you can also then alter this file and then have it update the database schema based on what you've altered. So very much from here on out, once you generate this, this is all you ever have to deal with. You never have to go and actually connect to your database other than to run an entity update command from the console.
The speed of the schema is going away.
Sorry?
Does the speed of the schema is going away?
This is just specific to how it's being implemented in Symfony. I am not sure exactly how they're going to manage that in Drupal 8. It may be that they've adapted some of these things to be compatible, but I'm not super up on that. So this is just sort of, if you're doing a generic Symfony application, this is kind of how Doctrine works. The schema is, okay, hook schema is going away. So in which case, I'm skeptical of ORMs by nature because I've had too many cases where the choices made by a machine are not really super performant or useful for me, and I've wanted more control than that. And generally, I sort of like to start with just a simple data mapper that I inject into my model and deal with it that way. But I didn't hate Doctrine as much as I thought I would, if that's a huge endorsement. But for me, that actually is kind of, yeah, it's a little bit of a pain sometimes to specify these things correctly, but it actually handles a lot of this stuff for you and handles it with some really intelligent defaults for the things you don't specify, and it gives you a chance to specify stuff that you need to otherwise.
Can you do the reverse, create the database and from that generate code?
I want
maybe some tool.
I want to say that you can, but I can't remember if that's out of the box or not. Because we actually had a case where they would, where in fact an application I was working on, they had their own external machine, external employee report that was getting run from whatever their big enterprise database backend was, and they would generate a report from that and then create a MySQL table from that and then override the users each time and possibly change the schema.
Doctrine will inspect the database.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, there is a database inspection aspect to it. Yeah, so yes, it will do the reverse for you. It will also then create getters and setters for you. So you don't have to do all of that for you. Notice that back in this class, everything's marked private. So if you're extending it or you can't access these directly from outside the object, you're going to need getters and setters, which is nice then because if you want to do any munging, before they get stored, or any, kind of massaging of the stuff as it comes out of the database, you have a place where you can do that, and it customizes it, recognizes any customizations you've done, and preserves them. But you can, if you add new stuff to the database, it'll actually pull it out and get it for you. So let me get through the rest of the stuff. So it generates them automatically. You can see that they're fairly simple. I just have it generated to support my IDE here, but none of this stuff's actually required. But it does very simple set name, get name. And again, to get all the entities, you're just pulling out this find all method, which is a base on it, and it will just pull out everything and stick it into an array and give it to you. It has all sorts of things for paginated queries and other stuff if you want to do those. To save, basically you get that same manager. There's a persist method. All you do is you implement your user class, fill it with whatever data you want to, and then just call persist and pass it in. And then flush afterwards. That's important because it does a lot of caching. And then afterwards, you just redirect away from it to your success page. So in the last couple of minutes here, let's go over how you do forms in it. I believe this is not coming over to Drupal 8, at least yet. So in Symfony, best practice is basically to have you create a form class, which then tells it how to generate a form. You can also then have validation in a configuration file, and all this kind of happens for you. And I'll have all these slides online later. So if I'm going fast now, you can go back and read. So a sample form class, again, there are tools to actually build a lot of this stuff for you based on your entity. But in this case, the main thing you want, it just requires these, the build form and the get name method. And get name, all it has to be is a unique name for it. And then you just add the particular fields that you want the form to display. You don't have to do all of them for a given entity. And in this case, I also have, because it's always useful to do, is just have the set the default options for the form. In this case, it says, go get your configuration and all the stuff about how this form should be displayed based on how this entity is set up. So it'll do some of the option stuff for you. It'll do some of the validation for strings and that kind of thing automatically. And one nice thing is, in order to do CSRF protection, put a token in there, all you have to do is just put these two parameters in. CRF protection true, and then what to call the actual token in your actual form. And it handles all that for you, including that's just part of its validation. It'll fail, and it'll give you a nice message. So here I'm actually taking one from an excerpt from a project I did rather than a simple user thing, just kind of show you how in-depth you can get here. You can just have text and just specify that it can't be blank. But you can also say, okay, it's going to have to be a file. Its max size can only be 50 megabytes. And I'm only going to allow these MIME types to be uploaded. And if it fails that validation, it then has a message that it can display custom based off of that. And all that's just configurable within that YAML file. So that's kind of neat. And then tying it all together, back to our create action. In this case, we're going to create the form. We're going to pass in a user type, that's the form class, and then we're going to pass in the entity a blank entity that we've created. We then call bind, so that takes all those values from the form, binds it, and populates your entity based on it. And then if it's valid, just form is valid call, we get the manager, we persist it like we did earlier, we flush it, and we return and redirect away with the success method. Otherwise, it just will go through, and if it's not valid, so the first time you come through, obviously it's not valid because you haven't filled it out yet. It just renders the actual form for you in that particular template, and you just pass it along as a parameter to it. So that is pretty much how it goes. So just finally, very quickly, you're going to have a lot more boilerplate with something like this, but Symfony gives you a lot of tools, and it allows you to not reinvent wheels, but it still allows a lot of customization. You are going to want a modern IDE to do this. I would not recommend just doing this kind of thing with a plain text editor. And seeing all these principles in action will kind of help you get ready for the mentality, especially if you want to look into how things have been implemented underneath the surface in Drupal 8. These OOP things are not as common in the way modules have been built up until now. So this stuff's kind of good to get to know, and get to know exactly where the state of PHP really is and why it's actually a super viable alternative to some of these other languages out there. Thanks. This is me on Twitter. It's PHP Architect. We have World coming in November in Tyson's Corner. It's going to have a Drupal track as well as a Symfony track, as well as WordPress track, as well as a number of others. And of course, we provide books, training, and the magazine. And anybody who wants to get in on winning one of these, just leave me your contact info, and can arrange that. Otherwise, and there probably will be other opportunities at World. Any questions? Yeah.
The directions vendor app, it's set up the same way.
I have not kept up with exactly how they've organized the file system on 8. So I know roughly kind of the components they're using, and I've talked with a couple of people about that, but I haven't followed it super closely to like know exactly if that's the same. My understanding is that they've taken bits and pieces and adapted it, to their needs. So it's some of it is very heavily influenced and is more complete. Other pieces are not so much. So, for example, the Symfony method of doing forms is not coming over. So it's a little bit like what you know and a little bit like what Symfony is, and possibly some stuff that kind of bridges the two. Yeah.
Is there a place for using Symfony in Drupal 7 setup, to clear-cut UT before 8?
The question is there a place to use Drupal Symfony with Drupal 7? There have actually been William Hurley, who's here from Forum 1, actually did a project where he integrated Zen Framework and Drupal 7. I think it was 7, not 6, where they had a very specific web application that needed to be maintained on its own that was then kind of wrapped in a traditional content management site. And so doing the two separately actually made it a bit of an easier development choice than trying to shoehorn content management into Zen Framework or trying to do this kind of rules-based, content, a very, very web appy kind of thing in Drupal, especially because it needed a lot of performance-level database schemas and that sort of thing. So it just made it an easier thing. So there are opportunities to do that, and you can because you have these multiple front controllers, you could hand off a portion of it to Drupal, and of course you could just vice versa, stick it in there. Configure your web browser appropriately or web server appropriately. Anything else? Thanks a lot. Appreciate it, and enjoy.
Thank you.